I've divided the chart into two slides here, this one and the next one. Across the top are 32 descendants of 3 sons of Mary Gann and Joseph Burchfield. I'm up there, David is up there. You can read those names, large chart outside. On the left margin of this slide and the next one are listed 8 of the Burchfield surname children of Joseph by his first and second wives. There are 5 on this slide, 3 on the next, but they all appear together on the same chart out front. The first 7 children are from the first wife. The 8th and last child on the chart is from the second wife. There is a combined total of 46 Burchfield descendants from these 8 children that can be compared to the, how many, 30, whatever I said? Got to scroll up. Of the 32 descendants from Mary Gann. Henry's descendants are not included here. I'm still waiting to get DNA tests on some of them. But Henry's paper trail is strong enough evidence of his descent from Mary and Joseph, so there's really, because he was underage when he married, all of the factors that I've been talking about, they point clearly to who Henry's parentage was. This is the second page of the chart out front. The findings should lay to permanent rest any thoughts that William Anderson Gann of the bottom far right chart was the son of Mary Gann. I'm sorry, but he was not. His parentage, like that of John and Judge George, remains waiting to be discovered. A false start is not a finish. It's not unusual for false genealogies to be theorized because we have to have an initial starting point of theory in order to research the records, correlate records, and resolve conflicting evidence where conflicts occur. With diligence and application of sound research principles aided by this wonderful tool of DNA we have, discovery of distant ancestors is entirely possible. As for Mary, and as already mentioned, she probably married her elderly widowed neighbor Henry Parrott in mid-1841 or thereabouts, during the time that the school census was being taken. Following Joseph's death in 1839, she would have had a great need to marry relatively soon in order to obtain support for herself and her minor children. Henry Parrott had a mutual need for a wife to be a homemaker for him. Polly Parrott's age on the 1850 census correlates with Mary's age on the 1830 and 1840 censuses. The said birthplace of Virginia is almost certainly an error, but Henry's family had actually come from there. So it's the kind of birth misattribution error that is somewhat common on censuses. Henry's 1853 will left a substantial 243 acres to his beloved wife, Mary Parrott. While beloved wife is a typical boilerplate type language, the large bequest indicates that Mary must have truly been loved by Henry. We might also take into consideration the naming that Joseph and Susanna named their children. This may indicate as well that Mary was some kind of extraordinary woman that people loved, they cared for her. Henry also gave his wife all that she had brought to the marriage. We can infer from that specific mention that Henry's wife owned real property in her own name, and it was not to be merged into his estate. And we know, of course, that Mary Gann did own her own land, the 25 acres just barely down the road from Henry's house. That the father of her boys, Joseph Burchfield, and her brother, Alexander, had helped survey in 1830. The surveyor's entry is the only known document on which Mary and Joseph's names appear together. The proximity of Henry Parrott and Mary Gann as lifetime neighbors, her ownership of her own land that is alluded to in Henry's will, and the presence of two particular testators to the will all indicate that Henry's wife, Mary Parrott, was likely the same person as my third great-grandmother, Mary Gann. The testators to Henry's will were near neighbors to Henry, and neighbors typically were called in to witness a will. But these testators had specific ties to Mary. William Russell was the husband of Mary Gann's niece, Margaret Gann, the daughter of Mary's brother, Alexander Gann. Wilson Burchfield was the son of Joseph Burchfield by Joseph's first wife. Therefore, Wilson was Mary's extra-legal stepson, not to be confused with her legal stepson, for Mary had no legal stepsons. But Wilson's connection was close enough to Mary for him to have some interest in her behalf. But because he was not a legal relative of hers, he would not likely to have been considered to have a personal interest in the property himself if the will were ever challenged. And it was not challenged. Henry is safeguarding Mary's interest in this will. The very next year after Henry's death, the widow Mary, in May 1854, sells the very same 243 acres of land to Henry's son, Job Parrott, for $240, roughly $1 per acre. Perhaps she sold the land because she needed some cash in hand more than she needed the land, since she already had her 25 acres. But I think we should also consider that Mary's liquidation of such valuable property could signify that she was making a major change in her life. Between 1850 and 1860, Mary's brother Alexander became a property owner for the very first time in his life. He had surely always lived on the 25 acres that Mary and Elizabeth had owned together. There is no clear indication by the census neighbors that he had actually moved. So the $50 in real estate that Alexander owned by 1860 may have been Mary and Elizabeth's 25 acres with its enhanced value by 30 years' worth of improvements. Or maybe the $50 of real estate was the 50 acres that Mary's son Henry had bought from Job Parrott in 1847, and which land adjoined Mary's and Elizabeth's land that Alexander was already living on. Sometimes deeds were not executed when land transitioned between close family members. Either piece of land or both could have been transferred by title bond to Alexander, but mentions of title bonds rarely ever turn up except in court records if some dispute arises. Mary does not seem to have returned to her little farm after Henry Parrott's death. She is not found on the 1860 census. She could be dead by this time. She could be disappeared into another marriage. But more typical for a widow woman of a certain age, her life probably merged into the family life of one of her adult sons. Mary's fifth son would have been 20 years old in 1850, 30 years old in 1860. His identity and whereabouts are unknown at this time. There is a timeline congruence in that Mary sold the property left to her in Henry's will in the same mid-1850s time period that Mary's son Henry was making his move to Missouri, and William was joining him there. Maybe Mary went to Missouri too. If she died in Missouri before 1860, because there are unmarked graves in that small family graveyard, Mary could be lying right there in the family graveyard. A correct history of the family of Mary Gann has been a long time coming, and we can be sure it will unfold even further as more and more DNA tests are being done. We may even discover the identity of her fifth son, who in all certitude was most probably a son of Joseph Burchfield, just like her other four boys were. The research has provided a few twists and turns and surprises, from the four brothers who weren't, to the layers of legal relationships signaled by that little two-letter word by, B-Y, in Henry's marriage bond. I want to leave you with one more surprise, and I think it's a lovely surprise, that came into view while tracing Henry's family. I hope you'll enjoy the short closing video of one of our cousins and the young man who became her forever husband. Thank you.